Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 12th of August 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. Well, weather. There is a little bit of weather out there, which is encouraging. We've got emerging blue skies and sunshine here in Plymouth. Some clouds, that's good. I'm told that Rhondda is unfortunately cloudy, whereas Rhyl is sunny, so you need to move across there. And what else have we got? Cloudy, bright and breezy in Norfolk, and some sunshine with streaky cloud, I think, in Hampshire. So the good news is there still is weather. And we've got David Scott will be joining us on Friday, which will be excellent. We're not sure whether David will be bringing a beaver with him from Scotland. Of course, if you haven't yet read the scientific report with the Daily Telegraph, do have a look at how beavers and ground squirrels are causing this global, not warming, climate change.
Yeah.
Serious stuff. Not quite as serious, though, as the attempts of US and British politicians to ramp up war in Europe.
Is Putin plotting war in Europe, according to the Daily Mail? And once again, the Daily Mail demonstrating that it's become an even more disgraceful propaganda outlet than the BBC. I don't know about you, Brian, but it seems to me increasingly clear that since the Daily Mail used our research to blow open the Leveson inquiry, they seem to have had an editorial shift in recent months.
Well, perhaps some pressure's been put on them, Mike, that they actually did something they didn't quite realise what they did by temporarily stalling state control of the press. Now, I think somebody's after them with a vengeance.
Yes, so anyway, the Mail says that experts warn Russia is actively preparing for conflict with NATO after announcing plans for 4,000 military exercises this year. 4,000. Large-scale exercises showed Moscow most likely had war plans in mind, according to the Mail. And so they go on. But if you actually look at the report that they're describing here, which is the one on the left from the European Leadership Network, it's a bit more measured, a bit more honest in their appraisal. And what they're saying is, they're asking the question, are Russian and NATO military exercises making war in Europe more likely? Of course they are, because there is this risk, as this report absolutely highlights, that the more of these types of exercises there are, the more chance there is that something untoward might happen by accident. So let's just look and see a couple of the maps that the report highlights. So this is Russian military exercises between the 16th and the 22nd of March this year, and there were 21 of those, according to this. And here is equivalent time sort of period, the second quarter of the year. And we've got 19 NATO military exercises. Now, I admit that most of the Russian military exercises were right up against the border with Belarus, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, and so on. Some close to the Finnish border, but whereas NATO seem to be spread out throughout Europe. But nonetheless, the scale of what's going on is equivalent. And in fact, if we look at what's going on later in the year, with Trident Juncture 2015, this is NATO's most ambitious exercise, is what they're saying. 36,000 troops involved in this one exercise, and although it's mainly based around the Mediterranean, it's still significant. This is the what they're calling the largest exercise since the Cold War, and we've got to keep in mind that we're supposed to be at peace. So both sides in this proxy that's going on at the moment actively exercising their troops. And as the report points out, this is dangerous, but of course it is not Putin planning for war in Europe.
Well, I mean, if you look at what's going on, Mike, in military terms, it makes sense for the Russians to be doing what they're doing, because we have watched the West supposedly downscaling at the end of the Cold War. Then all of a sudden we are pumping military assets back into Europe. Well, not Europe, we're putting them right up on the Russian border. We're equipping former eastern states with the latest weapons. And then we're telling Russia, well, of course, don't worry, this is nothing to do with a potential threat to Russia. Of course it is. And of course, Putin is going to respond. So could it be the Germans are getting a little bit squeamish? Because obviously they had a few problems with the German army at one stage. Could it be the Germans are beginning to say, well, actually, this NATO action is being ramped up too quickly? I think it's possible.
Well, the Russians are in fact reorganizing things, and this is Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, and he announced earlier in the week the creation of a new branch of Russia's armed forces, and they're calling this the Aerospace Forces, and this is a merger between the Air Force and the Aerospace Force. So it's a significant thing. He said Air Forces, anti-air, anti-missile defences and Space Forces will now be under a unified command, but this isn't all, because the entire Western Military District is getting reorganised as well, it seems. So we've got 2 new commands, both equipped with modern combat jets and helicopters, as well as S-300, S-400 and Pantsir S air defence systems. This involves the 6th Leningrad Air Force and Air Defence Army and so on. This is TASS reporting this, obviously. They intend to put up another tank army in the Western Military District and so on. So big reorganisation in response to, as you say, what NATO is doing in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia. And of course, we've got to remember that NATO claiming that the missile defences in those areas were to protect Europe from an attack from Iran. But that that risk apparently has been mitigated by the deal that's been done with Iran, and yet there's no sign of any sort of backtracking by NATO. They continue to install this equipment. So who is the enemy here?
Well, of course, the other thing we've got to remember is that David Cameron has savaged the British Armed Forces. So David Cameron, who says that he is so frightened of what Putin and the Russians are up to, has been dismantling Britain's armed forces. We've been hearing reports which seem to us at the moment to be credible, that the plan is for the RAF, or what is left of the Royal Air Force, to be subsumed into what is left of the British Army. So whatever Cameron is up to, there's something very wrong. You are saying that there's a threat of war building in Europe. What does Cameron do? He cuts the British Armed Forces. And of course, there's only one reason for that, and that is to increase the so-called power of the plan for the European army.
But the Russians have actually hit the nail on the head with what is the motivation for all this. This is Russian Duma Speaker Sergei
Just go for it.
Naryshkin, yes, got it. And he is close to Putin, of course. And he is saying, August has only just begun. However, its first events tellingly give a sense of what is a deeply political autumn. Judging by everything, some act of aggravation is being prepared. I'm confident we will not yield to such provocations. He said, today, as the situation is strained across the world, we should closely watch any political intrigue prepared on both sides of the Atlantic. It is important to see and analyse anything that is created in the West and offered to various international organisations. And he said, their external debt is enormous, and looting foreign states is a method that we're used to. And so this is really hitting the nail on the head. This is a recognition within Russia that the Western financial system is what is driving this war drive. And, at the end of the day, lots and lots of people refusing to do anything to prevent this war drive. We're not there. I don't see
demonstrations.
Where is the anti-war coalition at this point, and all the people that protested against the Iraq war? Okay, that was a bit more tangible at the time, but nonetheless, the danger must be recognised by everybody.
So we've got the constant rhetoric for war in Europe, Putin and Russia, the bad guys. And then let's not forget the other fear factor at the moment, which the media are going flat out for, is of course the threat of Islam and ISIS. So just have a look at this image, and perhaps if we discuss it for a few seconds, this could be trailer for a film, do you think, Mike?
Yeah.
Some sort of interesting. Clearly we've got a nun, we've got Spot the dog. The dog is called Spot, and she's got some polished gun. I would say that this is a pretty low-grade thriller of some description. Well, we'll ask the question, is this lady a nun? Well, unfortunately not, because actually it's the jihadi Sally Jones. And the British public is to believe that this lady is now one of the key jihadists working to recruit people to blow us up with pressure cooker bombs. Where would this sheer nonsense come from? Well, we've got to bring the Daily Mail back online. Here's the headline: married British ISIS commanders dubbed Mr. and Mrs. Terror. I wonder who dubbed them that. I would suspect that it was the Daily Fail in this case. And the bombers are ready to carry out lone wolf terror attacks in the UK. And we're back on the subject. This is slightly historical. VJ Day, plot targeting the Queen. So it's all about ISIS. It's all about the fact there's been contact with these jihadi terrorists. And we've now got Mr. and Mrs. Terror and Spot the Dog, who are plotting to kill us in our beds, if we believe this nonsense. So this is Junaid Hussain, and according to the story by two Daily Mail reporters, the husband and wife team shown on screen with Spot the Dog are actually in Syria recruiting terrorists to carry out atrocities in Britain. But the undercover reporters have just managed to get in touch with them, and there's been a little bit of discussion going on for months, and they supplied details of pressure cooker bomb making equipment. So get into the story, and it all changes a bit, because this is nothing to do with the Daily Mail. This has come from Sky News reporters posing as male and female jihadists on Twitter. Not sure how you do that. Presumably you dress up when you post the picture. But they've been posing as jihadists, twittering jihadists, and they contact the two ISIS militants. They're both British. Well, they would be, wouldn't they, Mr. and Mrs.? And then over a matter of months, these undercover journalists have got contact with some of the most wanted jihadists in the world, because the Americans have been looking for these people for months. They couldn't quite find them, but the two undercover journalists dressed up as online tweeting jihadists. I'm trying to keep a straight face as I say this. And they found them in 5 minutes. So we're going to say this is utter dross by Daily Mail journalists Simon Tomlinson and Richard Spillett. What sort of people would produce a report like this? Well, we thought we'd go to their Twitter pages, because that's clearly the place to go if you want to investigate ISIS. And here we've got Simon Tomlinson. Have a look at his tweets, because it's all nonsense, it's sport. It's got a picture of him there with a goldfish bowl full of wine. And we are to believe that this man knows what's going on in the serious matter of counter-terrorism. Well, if you're not convinced by Simon, have a look at Richard Spillett here. He at least has a picture of somebody with a big black beard, so clearly a terrorist. But apart from that, the rest of his Twitter page is as thin on the ground as the other gentleman. Now, why were we interested in this particular story? Well, really, it was the link to Sky News. And I have to say that last night we met a couple of people who've been doing some very good work for the UK column. And we were in a hotel. I think we can say where the hotel was. It was in Totnes in Devon. And we were sat there with many other people, quite a nice evening, having a conversation. But in the background was a huge TV screen. And we watched, fascinated, as over the next probably 3 hours, Sky News simply pushed out massive propaganda about ISIS. We saw black flags, we saw black dressed men doing push-ups for at least 10 hours without a break, and we saw Sky News. Well, what did we see? Let's have a look. These are some stills we took, a huge TV screen, and what were they saying? Well, they were interviewing so-called terrorists. So we're not sure how you get people close to these sorts of terrorists, because it's pretty difficult for GCHQ or CIA or even military, but Sky News has done it. So 3 hours of Sky News propaganda on ISIS threat with exclusive interviews with terrorists brought direct to a social venue near you. Well, how bad could it get? Well, pretty bad, because they ramped up the rhetoric with a whole range of maps and diagrams which said there was going to be an ISIS invasion of Europe and North Africa. and a nice little image of an atomic bomb in the background in case people having their lagers and wines in the hotel were not quite scared enough. We did actually speak to a couple of individuals and said that we were interested in the rhetoric on the TV, and I was fascinated by the response, because they laughed and said, well, what do you expect? So perhaps the public in Totnes, Devon at least, realised that they're watching utter propaganda coming through on the TV screen. But let's have a look at this one. It's going to be a major battle. It says on screen, a battle for the end of times. So we're labelling that fear, fear and more fear with a biblical twist. Of course, it's a battle for end times. This is very biblical. I think this is deliberate. We think the message is get ready for a war, Islam versus Christianity. And that's what these people would have us believe. And here we are, another label, quite literally they, that's these nasty Islamic terrorists, want to bring about Armageddon. And so according to Sky News, we've got another biblical thing here, Armageddon. Those nasty Muslims, they're going to invade North Africa and Europe. Don't know what's going to be happening with the European army. They'll all be on holiday, presumably. And then they started to congratulate themselves. So here we've got Sky News talking about its 4-month investigation. CIA can't do it, GCHQ can't do it, MI6 can't do it. But a couple of Sky News reporters are at the heart of terrorism in Syria. And we just make sure we've got that on screen. The combined intelligence services and military of the USA and UK can't locate and stop these people, but a couple of Sky News reporters get on Twitter and they've done the job. So here's Sky News. The Islamic State threat was uncovered. They've done it all themselves. And of course, they're pumping this fear-mongering into homes, bars and hotels across the UK 24 hours a day. What don't they want to get near? They don't want to get near this, when other sources are saying, well, actually what's going on is this whole thing is a scam ramped up by the British intelligence. It was an interesting evening, Mike.
But it really is 1984 stuff, this imagined enemy that you don't really ever see. The occasional event happens just to justify the rhetoric in the media by the Ministry of Truth. And
huge TV screens now just pumping this stuff. Nobody was watching it. That was, in a way, a good thing and a scary thing, because the propaganda was coming in. I think the only people who were really watching it to see what was being said was us. And when we said, can we photograph the screen, the people at that table were laughing and said, well, what do you expect from the British government? So what are we going to do? We give Totnes a 7 out of 10, I think, for that one.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us nicely to the BBC, because, of course, if we can't trust Sky News, what better place to go than the BBC? And congratulations to Guido Fawkes for some excellent blogging, because he picked up that the BBC had produced a huge advert for itself to celebrate the unique role that the BBC plays in our lives. He asked them how much money they'd spent on advertising themselves, and they quickly told him, we're not going to tell you because it's excluded from the Freedom of Information Act. The BBC is therefore not obliged to provide this information. And to reinforce it, they went on to quote Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights as to why the BBC, funded with 3.65 billion of taxpayers' money, shouldn't be forced to reveal how much they were spending advertising their pathetic organisation. Well done, Guido Fawkes. And things getting bad for journalists in America.
Well, of course, and for all those journalists on the Daily Mail who think they're doing a good job, of course, it is no protection to be working for the government when you're a journalist. Here we've got two US journalists who were reporting events in Ferguson last year. One working for the Washington Post, another for the Huffington Post. And they were briefly detained, according to this report, in August 2014, while they were working from the illustrious confines of a McDonald's restaurant to cover the protests at Ferguson. And if you remember, that was following the fatal shooting by police of Michael Brown. They have now been charged, apparently, for doing their jobs. This is the Committee to Protect Journalists. Their Deputy Director, Robert Mahoney, has said US authorities have no business hauling reporters into court for doing their jobs, especially on a world story like Ferguson. We're appalled by this judicial intimidation of Wesley Lowry and Ryan Riley, and call on St. Louis authorities to drop all charges immediately. If they are convicted, they're looking at $1,000 fine and up to a year in prison. This is now a direct attack by the state on, in the US at least, on journalists.
Well, they're a bit late, aren't they? Because of course we've been arresting journalists for some time in UK, to the extent that the mainstream journalists we are occasionally able to speak to have admitted that they're getting pretty miffed with the police trying to accuse them of harassment if they follow up stories. Particularly, I might add, stories to do with the abuse of children. What a surprise. Well, where does that take us to? Water, the economy.
Yeah, this must be related to global warming, of course, and nothing to do with El Nino at all. But Los Angeles now has decided to put 20,000 plastic balls into a reservoir to stop evaporation, apparently, because the drought is so bad.
I'm glad you've told me that, Mike, because I did think on first glance that was a beaver army unloading from a lorry.
Yeah, could be. But, this apparently is going to stop the evaporation and save 300 million gallons of water from evaporating every year, so that's great. Except, of course, this drought isn't just in California. And in fact, the Panama Canal is now placing limits on shipping and basically the size of ships that are going to be able to travel through the Panama Canal because of the drought. And of course, this is a direct result of lack of any decent economic policy that cannot cope with this, what are absolutely normal periodic weather conditions. El Nino comes around every once in a while, and it has a pretty devastating effect on global weather every time it does. And yet we're not able to cope. So let's just contrast that with of course, Suez Canal, which has in fact just had the world's largest container ship run through the new Suez Canal, and that's the Marstal Maersk, and that's 200,360 tons, a length of 380 meters and a width of 59 meters. Is fairly large. I apologize for using European money there, but I don't have the
true
measurements just off the top of my tongue.
And were you using your thumbs for those measurements?
Oh, it was, yes.
Good.
Yes. But as Reuters is reporting here, of course, and this is the key point about the Suez situation, this is being used, this infrastructure project is being used to drive the rest of the Egyptian economy. So what we've got here is President al-Sisi issuing a decree establishing an economic zone for the new Suez Canal, 460 square kilometers. Again, I should have converted that into real money, around the canal. And what are we talking about here? 42 projects. So we've got ports, we've got, sorry, apologize, just lost my track here. They've got a whole range of different new economic projects being built, and we've got thousands and thousands and thousands of Egyptians all heading in that direction, looking for employment, and they're likely to get it as well. So
that's extraordinary. Egyptians getting employment in their own country. What an extraordinary concept that is.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And what's more, it's productive employment as well. It's not shelf stacking or coffee serving. Meanwhile, back in the UK, of course, Jeremy Corbyn, his team, they are going to deal with the UK deficit, apparently. And of course, all the focus on the economy, and particularly with regard to public finances and why we have to live in a world of austerity, it's always the word deficit which is used. So let's just remember what that means. The government deficit is the amount of money over and above tax receipts that it spends. So in other words, it's the amount of money that it has to borrow each year in order to meet its obligations. But it does not represent the national debt. So I just want to once again highlight what the situation is in this country with regard to national debt, because of course the deficit is a mere fraction each year of outstanding government debt, which currently stands at £1.56 trillion. And of course, GDP in this country is about 1.8 trillion at the moment, if you believe that figure. And if you just look on round the wheel here, household debt of 1.5 trillion, bank bailouts, well, we've mostly paid a lot of that back, so it's only 115 billion pounds left there only. We've got public finance initiative debt, and of course that's the one that's responsible for the problems that Bart's Health Trust is suffering at the moment. 222 billion there, another 1.6 trillion in corporate debt. But the big elephant in the room, of course, just as a reminder, is state and public pensions, which is a Ponzi scheme. It's unfunded, and therefore you've got to use tax receipts in order to pay people's pensions each year. And the outstanding amount at the moment is around £5 trillion. So remember, that's 1.8 trillion is our GDP, and our obligations, our debt to the pensioners, present and future, of current working age is £5 trillion. So £13.6 trillion altogether is what is owed in this country. And what's Corbyn doing about it? Well, he's talking about his people's quantitative easing. So he is going to use debt to finance what? Well, he is talking. Let's see what he's actually talking about. People's QE is fundamentally different, according to his team. It does have the Bank of England print new money, which is identical to the process that is in use by ordinary banks when they lend to business. But it gives that money to people like housing authorities, local councils, a green investment bank to build houses, to schools, and to build hospitals. So in other words, there's nothing productive in that, nothing whatsoever. He is going to use this money to buy people off, and clearly that is not in the sort of in the mold of what's going on in Egypt, where the money that was raised was used for an infrastructure project, which has then become a driver for other economic activity. None of this is going to be a driver for economic activity. And let's not forget that Bank of England notes are promised to pay. They are promissory notes. And let's just remind ourselves what the Bradbury pound was. It was not a promissory note. It was a legal tender currency note, somewhat different. And let's just for the sake of a bit of amusement, throw this in. Remember that the sort of icon that's used by the City of London and the Bank of England is the dragon. And if you remember, the second edition of Bradbury pounds had George slaying the dragon. And this is really the key point here. Unfortunately, Corbyn's people's quantitative easing will not slay the dragon of the City of London by any means. In fact, it is operating absolutely within that infrastructure. And he's not proposing that the money be spent on productive things. So I do not see how this benefits, really.
And we could also say, what is he up to at the moment? I mean, it seems to me there's another massive play of Mr. Corbyn and the Labour Party in the press and media. So one minute he's the saviour, the next minute he's the bad man. What is actually going on? We don't know. Well, I don't know at the moment.
Well, I think what we're seeing is a massive faction fight within. I mean, there's a lot of positive things about him, and he supports the idea of Glass-Steagall, for example, which is absolutely essential. And so there's a massive faction fight within the Labour Party, of course, because most of the Labour establishment do not want to see him lead the party.
No.
But I think he's been given some bad advice on the People's QE initiative. And he needs to think a bit more productively than that.
Okay.
And of course, the other big economic news at the moment is the furore, the fear mongering over China, and China's exports slump 8%. It raises pressure for more stimulus, and of course, all this nonsense about what's going on in the Chinese stock market at the moment. But let's just put this into a bit of perspective, because of course, China's exports slump is the portion of Chinese exports which are going to Western countries. So that's Europe, the United States, Japan. And that's the main reason for this Chinese export slump. So this is more a reflection on the Western economy than it is on the Chinese economy. And in fact, if we look at the BRICS Post, for example, they're talking about the increases, 8.3% or so. Actually, if you look at a particular statistic for the increases in trade with BRICS nations. But at the end of the day, what is China's response to to the economic problems that the world is seeing. Well, they're building more and more infrastructure, and here again we've got Russia and China cooperating, $240 billion for high-speed rail link. And this kind of infrastructure development is going on amongst the BRICS nations every day of the week. We're not being told about it. It is happening though, and really what's going on in the Western financial system, they don't really care about too much. Yeah. You know, $240 billion. We're not spending that kind of money in infrastructure. Neither is the United States. So who's got the brains here?
Well, we've got a Prime Minister called David Cameron, Mike, so I think it's unlikely if the brains will be in the United Kingdom. Well, whatever's going on in an economic sense worldwide, what's driving the agenda in UK? Well, of course, it's the abuse of children. And we've picked up on some interesting information around that. The Guardian here has made quite big of a case where originally a little girl, 4 years old, was put into adoption. She was then handed away to other people in Africa, where she was badly abused. She's now 14 years old, and Mrs. Justice Pulfley has overturned the adoption order. Now, this is something that the family courts have always said was just not possible. If somebody was adopted, they could never be brought back into their blood family. Well, Justice Pulfley has done exactly that. And so this girl is going to be returned to her family, and she's going to get her name changed back to her original family name. What Pulfley said is her experience of adoption, particularly the arrangements made for her after the age of 6, would seem to have been extremely abusive. Well, basically, Judge Pulfrey, remember this is the same judge who's presided over the Holly Gregg abuse case and the Hampstead case. Judge Pulfrey admits serious social service failings led to serious child abuse, but this judge really doesn't comment on that. There's nothing to see, nobody to blame. It was a bit of a mistake, and as long as the girl is handed back, well, that's the end of the matter. I think Mrs. Justice Pulfley is desperate for good publicity because, of course, many people are now watching her performance in court, and with the Hampstead case as one classic example, matters which were clearly criminal and should have been brought into a criminal court were swept under the carpet within Justice Pulfrey's private court. So
what support is this family going to have when this child, probably damaged by what's happened, goes back?
Well, they've got no support, Mike, none at all. And we'll just say that we are still waiting for a reply to our open letter to the Goddard inquiry, when we asked Justice Goddard what she was going to do to protect vulnerable child abuse victims. Terms of reference actually stated that was part of her role, to look after the needs of child abuse witnesses coming forward. Absolute silence from the Goddard inquiry at the moment. So it's the usual thing, really, Mike, no help at all. And it's no good child abuse victims looking for help from the CPS. This is a clip which I deliberately took with Alison Saunders with her eyes closed, the boss of the CPS, because on camera this lady said something which I just thought was so remarkable we needed to capture it. She said people can have confidence in the wrong decision she made about Jana because it's now been overturned. So people can be totally confident in the performance of her CPS, Crown Prosecution Service to Work, because she made a really crass decision, but not to worry because that was overturned, so people can have confidence in me.
I mean, you couldn't say anything other than common purpose at this point, could you?
Well, something scrambled in that lady's brain, and of course one of the things we know with the sort of common purpose mentality is mistakes, perfectly natural, everybody makes them. You make a mistake, somebody dies, child gets abused, doesn't matter, just move on. I think it's time for Alison Saunders to go. Blind? No, I think there's a bit more to it. She believes her own rhetoric, and she's going to make more bad decisions and more people are going to suffer. Well, a subject that's come to the fore is, of course, the scale of the police operation looking into child abuse. And if we start to delve into this, we immediately start to look at the Independent Police Complaints Commission, because they've been investigating police forces across the country, including the Met Police, for failing to carry out proper child abuse investigations. So this is quite an important organisation, and of course it is independent. Let's have a look at that. Well, here we are. The IPCC is independent, and if we look into their own documentation, it says it is operationally independent of the police, government and complainants. So absolutely brilliant. This is an independent organisation the public can trust. Well, if we get into the small print a little bit more closely, we find some interesting things. We can see that in fact IPCC is central government and is controlled by the Home Secretary. So let's have a look at this. Paragraph 1.9, for the purposes of public administration, the IPCC is classified as a non-departmental public body. For national accounts, it's classified to the central government sector. Well, you control the money, you control the organisation, so the government controls it. Who's got overall responsibility? Well, surprise, surprise, it's Theresa May as Home Secretary. She's got overall responsibility. Sorry, she holds overall responsibility for the Home Office and its agencies and will account for the IPCC's business in Parliament. So it can't do anything unless Theresa May approves. And then we go on to carrying out responsibilities specified in legislation, including appointments to the Commission and approving the terms and conditions of Commission members. So she's in control of that as well. And members of the Commission are appointed by the Secretary of State for the Home Department. So there we go. It says it's independent. Clearly it's not. It's working for the government with people appointed by the government. So let's come in a different angle and have a look at the National Police Chiefs Council. Thank you. I always have trouble with that because I nearly say NSPCC. It's so remarkably similar. Let's see what they say. Following a meeting of senior officers in Merseyside in the last few weeks, a stream of work called Operation Hydrant was established so as to allow a central strategic coordination group to collate and share information, advice and best practice among forces who are investigating allegations of, there's the word, historic child abuse, where there were persons of public prominence, PPPs. And he goes on, in the interim, I've written to all forces asking them to provide the strategy group with information of any historic abuse, not interested in anything going on at the moment, historic abuse involving institutions and PPPs, so that we can build up a national picture and commence our work in sharing the relevant information and advice between forces. Notice there's nothing there about dealing with child abuse. It's all about collaboration and collecting information.
So sharing the relevant information and advice, that would be the relevant cover-up information and advice?
Absolutely to cue, Mike. Thank you for that. Well, let's have a look at how it works. We're going to dissect David Cameron's Conservative paedophile investigation and, as you've intimated, Mike, drawing out the victims and evidence and shutting off the hydrant to protect the government. So let's remember, top of the tree, David Cameron. What has he repeatedly said in public? That he's dismissive of sex abuse claims. And in one report I read this morning, he said the whole thing is conspiracy theory. Well, of course, his chum is the lovely Theresa May, MP, Home Secretary. She is in charge of the National Police Chiefs Council. They're not going to operate without her say-so. And they are sitting over Operation Hydrant, the coordination hub. 11 police forces so far are now collaborating in a so-called investigation, and we're led to believe they're looking at some 1,433 men, of which 76 politicians, 43 bigwigs in the music industry, and 135 TV, film, radio, and presumably BBC in that, Mike. Well, who is involved with heading up NPCC? nobody better than Sarah Thornton, the ex-chief of Thames Valley Police. And of course, it was her police force that was seriously condemned for utterly failing to deal with serious sexual abuse and even turning some girls, some abuse victims, away from police stations when they went for help. Teresa has appointed the so-called independent Goddard inquiry. Well, of course, not independent at all because Teresa's controlling it. And we just mention NSPCC because, of course, you think you're dealing with the Goddard inquiry. In fact, you're dealing with NSPCC. Bring in Bernard Hogan Howe, Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police. Well, he's at the centre of an investigation over the failings of his officers to investigate child abuse, particularly around Dolphin Square. And what do you need to help that little process? You need the Independent Police Complaints Commission, which is apparently investigating the Met Police for failing to investigate itself. Are you with me so far, Mike?
I am, yeah.
Okay, well, let's carry on, because don't forget the Met Police has been working hand in glove with NSPCC, the charity that nobody wants to investigate. And if we have a look at those politicians, well, of course, they're connected with the Met Police and Theresa May and Cameron in the first place. So we'll just end on the note, isn't it interesting that a definition of hydrant is an upright pipe with a spout, nozzle or other outlet, usually in the street for drawing water from a main or service pipe, especially for fighting fires? I think they chose that name because the aim of hydrant is to close down the evidence as it comes forward. 1,433 men. Why is that significant? No mention of women. The government wants us to believe that all paedophiles are men, and therefore we're not going to look at women. Well, we thought we'd bring up this article, particularly unpleasant, in the Mail. Depraved bank workers jailed for sexually abusing a baby girl during a sordid affair. David Harper encouraged his married colleague Jennifer Maguire to take photos as she abused the infant. And this is the reality, of course, 50-50 ratio. So utter lies and spin by Theresa May and David Cameron's presumably pro-paedophile government. Well, where are the police? Not investigating child abuse. They're strolling on sunny beaches because the British police are now working in Magaluf to look after hordes of drunken young British teenagers who are presumably there because they haven't got a job or anything better to do. What you're really watching, though, is the start of integration of European police forces. So I think we can expect to see fairly shortly Spanish or Polish or East European police, particularly operating on London streets. Well, there we are, a pretty gloomy picture. If you're thinking, what can you do about it? You need to speak out. You need to talk to friends, relatives. You need to be doing something every day, even if it's just one letter. You need to be holding politicians to account, talking to the press and media, and demanding that those in the public sector tell the truth and do their jobs. So, can we make a difference? We think that's already happening, but we need many more people. If you like what we're doing at the UK Column, please consider taking a subscription or making a donation. We can only do what we do with your help and support.
I have one quick announcement.
Indeed.
Anybody that has had a look at the front page of the British Constitution Group website will see a fantastic presentation by John Bingley on the British Constitution. And we now have had made available to us, thank you very much, a couple of 100 DVDs of that talk. And if you would like to get a free copy of that to give, or multiple free copies to give to other people, please get in touch. If you give Carol an email, that's Carol with an E, C-A-R-O-L-E, at ukcolumn.org, and with your name and address, and she'll get whatever you need sent out to you.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much for joining us. Don't be gloomy. Action conquers fear. We'll see you same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.